last night. She said that you'd already contacted her, so that was really nice. That was nice. Yes, she was. She was. In fact, I was going to look up her notes in case.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all who have joined us today, and thank you to staff who have put together this Housing Trust Fund report. We're here for a committee of the whole to discuss the report regarding a housing trust fund for Johnson County, Kansas. I'm going to start by asking the clerk to please call the roll.
Commissioner Fast.
Commissioner Myers.
Myers, aye.
Commissioner O'Hara.
Here.
Commissioner Hanslick.
Hanslick here.
Commissioner Ashcraft.
Here.
Commissioner Allenbrand.
Allenbrand, aye.
And Chairman Kelly.
I am here as well. Everybody is present. We are joined by Megan Foreman as well as Mark Dapp, and we'll be shortly joined by Joe Connor to discuss this report. With all of our guests here today, I'd ask that you join me in checking your cell phones and making sure that they're on silent. Thank you all very much for your patience. This is a committee of the whole. This is an opportunity for us to discuss something we have asked staff to research and provide a little bit of direction on it. We're not going to take public comments at committees of the whole, but I appreciate some of you who came and provided comments earlier today, or others who have emailed us, called us, and otherwise provided your thoughts regarding a housing trust fund for Johnson County. We are going to start with this presentation. There's some natural stopping points for questions. For the courtesy of staff, I'd ask that we hold our questions until that time, and then we will circle back at the end of the presentation for commission discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan Foreman to start the discussion. Ms. Foreman, welcome and thank you.
Yes, thank you all for having us today. My name is Megan Foreman. I'm the housing coordinator for Johnson County.
Mark Dapp, Deputy Budget Director for Budget and Financial Planning.
Okay. So just to sort of dive right in, I wanted to retrace our steps a little bit and talk about why we're here, talking about housing trust funds. This was a policy option that was recommended for further study by the BOCC's Housing Subcommittee, which wrapped up its work in April of this year with a report to the whole board in April. This green box on the slide here is just an excerpt from that report. And then in June, as Chairman Kelly mentioned, the BOCC requested that the CMO's office review and evaluate the feasibility of establishing a housing trust fund in Johnson County, and that passed on June 8th. So in answer to that request, you have a written report, which was emailed to all of the commissioners on October 19th, and this presentation is really just sort of the cliff notes of that report. I do want to thank Hannah Pierce, who is a student research intern over the summer who provided excellent research assistance. The materials also include some short summaries of the actions nearby cities have taken on housing trust funds. And then the stuff on the right there is really just the key publications and experts that undergirded a lot of the research that we did. There was a seminal report on housing trust funds from a group called Community Change, which included a nationwide survey of all of the city and county trust funds that were around in 2016 when that report was created. And then the Urban Neighborhood Institute's Promoting Equitable Neighborhoods report provided a lot of the research basis for the Kansas City, Missouri Housing Trust Fund that we're going to talk about. So I may refer to this report moving forward as the LISC report, since they were a major contributor and were also kind enough to lend their expertise in some interviews and reviewing the documents that we sent you. LISC and Mark are a great asset that we have working right nearby and are leading the work to stand up a regional housing trust fund as we go. So we'll also talk about that a little bit. So today's objectives, the purpose of this COW is really twofold. It's to establish a shared understanding of what trust funds are and what they are not, and for the BOCC to provide staff direction on this issue moving forward. Okay. So we'll also raise a couple of major policy considerations that need to be addressed should the county want to pursue a housing trust fund. And those are really around the governance structure and the sustainable funding source that the BOCC would like to identify. Ultimately today, staff are looking for direction on the questions of interest in further study on identifying an ongoing revenue source and whether or not establishing a housing trust fund is a leading priority for staff. So to sort of start off here, housing trust funds are distinct funds that are established by a city, county, or state government that receive ongoing dedicated sources of public funding to support the preservation and production of affordable housing and increase opportunities for families and individuals to access decent, affordable homes. In a nutshell, a housing trust fund is really a pool of funds that are dedicated to addressing a community's housing needs through sustained long-term funding. It's important to note that sustainable funding, or this ongoing and dedicated funding, is really baked into the definition of a housing trust fund. Allocating one-time funding to a housing project is not a housing trust fund. I think there's some misconception out there that communities that fund some of these housing projects are starting housing trust funds, and that's really not the definition of what we're going for today, so it's kind of why I'm dwelling on that a bit. So broadly speaking, housing trust funds contribute to attainable housing by providing funding to address housing needs. The funding can offer flexible dollars and be used to leverage other public funds for housing. This can be federal programs like the Home Investment Partnerships or CDBG funding, or state low-income housing tax credits, or private or philanthropic contributions. The capital stack on development projects often requires several sources of funding, and a housing trust fund is often used to fill that gap. And if these projects are designed correctly, housing trust funds can streamline the application and administration of these other housing dollars. And really, kind of the opportunity to blend and braid these funding types means that more viable projects are ultimately created. Ultimately, the availability of housing trust fund dollars is intended to encourage the market to produce units that they otherwise would not. We have a lot of housing development in Johnson County. The challenge is that these units really aren't affordable. The market is not on its own building the kinds of housing that our vulnerable populations need. So to sort of get a little bit into the details with that, some marked data show that Johnson County is missing about 7,700 deeply affordable units that would rent for about $650 a month. I don't know if anybody in the room is a renter, but $650 a month is sort of a unicorn. You're really not going to find that. These units can include ones that are accessible for seniors or people with disabilities, and Johnson County has no permanent supportive housing. We know that there's also need across that housing continuum, and housing trust funds can play a role here too by providing loans or grants to preserve existing affordable housing stock, or thinking about sustainability and energy efficiency across different housing types, or even helping first-time homeowners access the market with down payment assistance. So housing trust funds can be hyper-local and are really built to suit the needs of the community. The goals and activities of the fund can be scaled up or down depending on the amount of resources that are allocated. They should be designed to be adaptable and flexible and meet the emerging housing needs or gaps in the market more quickly than other funding sources. And having the funds already set aside allows for communities to be more proactive than reactive on some of the emerging housing issues. A housing trust fund in Johnson County should target the type of development that we're missing. There's a lot of data about exactly what that is, and it was purposely left out of this presentation at this time, but identifying exactly what housing need and housing trust fund would fill as a critical second step if we want to move forward in this process. Just to sort of get the juices flowing about what's possible, some examples of the kind of projects a housing trust fund might support would be subsidizing permanent supportive housing, or permanently affordable rental units, which I mentioned. It could also focus on encouraging developers to build this missing middle housing type that we don't have a lot of. And this is really any kind of housing unit, usually for homeowners, that's not a single family home. So a townhome, a condo, a patio home. It would offer more price points for people to enter the market, especially those first-time home buyers. And ultimately more housing choice. Maybe an older couple has finished raising their children and they're looking to maybe stay in the community but downsize, or a condo might be the right kind of opportunity for a younger couple to get in and start building equity and practicing homeownership on a less expensive or labor-intensive option like a condo or a co-op. So really it just kind of goes back to that concept of housing choice. The hope is also that this dedicated public funding attracts other investment from maybe large employers who are thinking about where their workforce might live, or philanthropy looking to make a difference in the housing space. The funds can hopefully make a bigger impact if they're building on one another. So pictures, so we don't get too bored. This is where I sort of pause and acknowledge that this is really a fire hose of information, and pursuing a housing trust fund means we sort of have to figure out how to sip it through a straw. But we need to be thoughtful that the impact of a housing trust fund can be minimized as the number and diversity of demands on that fund grow. It's most powerful when the resources are targeted to a small number of well-defined types of projects. So as we consider whether we want to pursue a housing trust fund, there are really two policy questions that we need to address. The first is how it will be sustainably funded, and the second is how it will be structured and administered. It's really tempting here to offer a third policy question, which is the type of projects that would receive Housing Trust Fund funding, but that's arguably really hard to do without first thinking through the amount of revenue the fund would be working with and the complexity of its activities. Part of the reason for that is that the scale and impact of a housing trust fund really depends on the amount of funding. So on the small end, projects could include something like supportive services or accessibility modifications. Mid-range projects might start to get into development or some first-time homebuyer assistance. But it's really only with a sizable amount of funding do we get into projects that can have market-moving impacts and really create the new types of housing that are otherwise not being developed in Johnson County. So I do want to sort of reiterate that a housing trust fund is a tool in the toolbox as we think about policy actions, but it's not a silver bullet that can address all of these policy challenges. A housing trust fund should focus on the critical housing needs that are otherwise not being met by other organizations and jurisdictions. The funding opportunities at several points along the continuum where an HTF could build on progress already underway. So for instance, projects might shore up planned investments to address homelessness or maybe create that next step housing type after shelter. Or it might offer landlord support for unit improvements as an incentive to rent to voucher holders. I think there's a lot of different directions that it could go. The funding for these projects is a part of the policy response, but it's really only a part. If we continue down this path, much of the work that remains to ensure the funds are used efficiently and effectively. Mark is going to take it from here and dig into some of the funding options available.
Thank you very much, Megan. Before we dive into the funding sources, are there general questions, just high-level questions about the Housing Trust Fund models that Ms. Foreman has discussed? Commissioner Fast?
Just want to, Robin Symes, you have, and I've looked at all the models across the nation and ones, you can have an external that we go through a bank, CapFed, Chase, or we could have an internal fund dedicated. Is that correct, Robin? And Megan, and then that internal designated fund would draw interest, but you have less banking fees and administration fees because you're managing it internal. Am I correct on that? I just used the word internal, and it was kind of hard to understand. Can you explain more about an internal housing trust fund?
I apologize, and some of that does come down to just that size and level of complexity. If we wanted to partner with a financial institution so that this type of fund could be more like a bank, offering below market access capital or access to capital, things like that, much bigger projects, we would need to think about how we partner. Sometimes these housing trust funds are very small and they're administered by one or two staff people internal to an organization, and that looks a little bit more like maybe what they've got going on in Topeka with Lawrence, with their housing trust fund there. Those grant dollars are smaller. They're not requiring a whole lot of the oversight that more financial institutions or products that a financial institution would offer. So, you really have a lot of different options to choose from very complex to very simple.
And not to get too far ahead of maybe Mark's dive into this, but CDFI would also be an option, right?
Absolutely.
Community Development Financial Institutions, like an alt cap or something.
Right, and so then you would kind of think about how banks get into Community Reinvestment Act and start sort of layering your products that way. But that's a lot more complex and probably would require some partnership with outside organizations to administer and.
Thank you. Other questions before we Mark? Mr. Dapp, go ahead.
Wonderful. So as Megan identified, there are two policy questions that are kind of central to this discussion. The first is obviously funding. What we are trying to make clear here is that sustainable funding is really the key to a housing trust fund. You can equate that sustainable funding or dedicated funding to the trust fund component. We will get into some more detail with some examples, but there are other cities, Topeka and Wichita, that have identified initial funding, but have not identified that ongoing or dedicated funding source, which means that they are technically not housing trust funds. So we want to make that very clear, that sustainable and dedicated funding source is vital to kind of fulfilling the criteria of what a trust fund truly is. There are a couple of definitions. We provided one at the beginning of the presentation, but specifically about sustainable funding sources should be used to prioritize two factors, potential to generate revenue and those with the most public and policymaker support. I think that's pretty obvious, but how exactly does this look moving forward? The quote is that recent literature would suggest that there is not one source of revenue in sustaining housing trust funds, but a cocktail of approaches of resources. And that's what we will see moving forward, is try to review what are these different options that we could potentially pull some from a couple of different places to create that sustainable and dedicated funding model moving forward. So the kind of first bucket of sustainable funding options that are provided for consideration is a dedicated mill levy. This would be specifically a mill levy that would be dedicated to the Housing Trust Fund. There are other examples of this within the organization now, with Parks and Rec and libraries both administering a mill levy specific for capital projects. Those are dedicated to those particular types of purpose. If we chose to go down this route of a dedicated mill levy, it would mirror that process very closely. This provides the most consistent revenue source and protects from those political fluctuations or the uncertainty that comes with an annual appropriation and being subject to being funded on an annual basis. Another option that would be available is a dedicated sales tax, and this really follows the best practices of aligning the revenue and expenditures. What is notable is that sales tax revenue and receipts are more volatile than ad valorem taxes just in its nature. It would require legislative approval, as we would need approval from the legislature to be able to offer this new dedicated sales tax. But in order to kind of think about this and what this looks like in reality, this is very similar to the Kansas City, Missouri model, where they have identified a 3% local tax on recreational marijuana sales. 1% of that 3% goes to the unhoused population, and therefore it is serving as kind of a nexus to the Housing Trust Fund to provide annual revenue that is collected. The city of Lawrence also has a very similar model. Their public sales tax is restricted to public transportation, infrastructure, and affordable housing. It is levied specifically for that purpose and dedicated to go to those ends. To date, that's raised roughly $5.7 million of revenue and provided roughly 659 units, and we'll get into more detail on that particular model as well. An additional item for consideration would be a new sales tax, so that the county does have the capacity to add additional sales tax. This would again require legislation or approval from the state legislature and would also require approval from the voters, but it is an option that we have available in our toolkit. The kind of final quasi-sustainable funding option is the annual appropriation process. So if we were to set Housing Trust Fund as a priority for the county, we would build this into the county as the county budget as a regular expense. It would be reviewed annually as part of the budget process. Ultimately, we think that this would probably be a smaller appropriation than what would be received if we had dedicated revenue sources to feed this program directly. And then it would obviously be subject to what is feasible in each one of those budget years. So, there's kind of much more external influence is subject to policymaking and decision-making from this board on the level of funding that would be provided, but there would not be that dedicated, sustainable source going in there. We would rely on the annual budget process to be able to set what the funding amounts would be.
And Commissioner Fast, to just sort of pick up on your question, you know, in a model like this with an annual appropriation, we may need to look at staff and program support to administer in-house. Oftentimes with those much more complex housing trust funds, that cost for staff administration comes from the fund itself. That tends to be between 5 and 15% of the overall fund, and that's just usually used as part of a contract with another institution. So it's worth pointing out that the Regional Housing Partnership, which two of our commissioners sit on, is convened by Mark and Lisk and is also pursuing a housing trust fund as part of their suite of activities to address housing metro-wide. They recently contracted with Kansas City Community Land Trust and Folks Capital to develop a business plan or really sort of set out what those administrative structures would look like. Preliminary info on this should all be available by 2023, or the end of this year, 2023. And I think that we're in a good position to learn alongside Mark and Lisk as they sort of figure out some of these processes. In their vision, Lisk would administer the fund, and they have the financial and technical expertise to offer services like underwriting and loan management. And their goal is really to develop a large housing trust fund that can offer below market rate investments and low interest loans or grants. It remains to be seen how each community will choose to interact with the regional fund. I mean, if you think about it, Kansas City, Missouri now has their own fund. So we'll have to sort of see how that interplay works out. And all of Johnson County's options are on the table to participate at whatever level makes sense moving forward. I just wanted to mention that it's not the only initiative on housing that's moving forward in the Regional Housing Partnership, and Johnson County is at the table for all of the others, including Mark just submitted a proposal for a very large HUD grant. They're considering land trusts and improving relationships with developers, as Commissioner Hanslick mentioned earlier today. So how are the neighboring housing trust funds funded? There are several different examples. And I think it's instructive to look at how differently they've all been developed. It might give you some insight as to why the staff recommends that we begin with the sustainable funding question and let that kind of guide some of the other structures. So Kansas City's Housing Trust Fund is by far the most robust. It was created in 2018, but it did sit empty until two different city council allocations of ARPA funds in 2021 and 2022 that brought the balance up to about $25 million. In November of 2022, voters approved $50 million in general obligation bonds. The revenue source for that was an existing property tax that the city had finished paying off other bonds and then utilized those property tax revenues that were already being collected. So they didn't raise taxes to do it, but they had the revenue source already there. And Mark mentioned the 3% local excise tax on recreational marijuana. This funding, this 1% of funding, is not actually going into the Housing Trust Fund, but it is sort of working alongside that Housing Trust Fund. If we think about the continuum of housing where you need to address everything from homelessness all the way through to creating new units in the market. So those two different policy choices are working together to address that whole continuum. In the city of Lawrence, they probably have the most functional housing trust fund in the area. And they did create that through a special sales tax in 2017, as Mark mentioned. And their dedication of $5.7 million over that time period has led to the creation of 659 new units. I do have to kind of give a shout out for that dashboard and how they're really tracking progress with that fund in real time. It's nice to be able to see and look at. And just to note that housing is not the only use of that sales tax, as Mark mentioned. So a couple of other examples for your consideration. The City Council in Topeka created the administrative structure of a housing trust fund in 2019 and did pass it into statute, but it wasn't funded at the time. The first and only funding allocation came in 2021, and it was $250,000. But the stipulation was that it could only be used for matching funds, and this was really an attempt to trigger other investment into that fund. That fund hasn't supported any projects yet, and it sounds like the city is sort of in a process of redesigning or rethinking what they're doing with that at the moment. We've also heard that Wichita has started a housing trust fund, but this is inaccurate. City staff will tell you that it is an affordable housing fund, and it was started by utilizing $5 million in recaptured ARPA revenue. And it's really a hyper-targeted program that's used to preserve and create new units in the urban core, formerly redlined areas that have suffered from disinvestment. So Wichita's program is really a limited grant fund, not a housing trust fund. So if that wasn't enough, we have policy question number 2.
Well, can we hold right there?
Yes.
And maybe answer some questions? Instead of stating our opinions and getting into the policy debate here, maybe some questions for clarification from either Ms. Foreman or Mr. Datt. Commissioner Fast.
So KCMO hasn't identified a sustainable funding source. I mean, they did the bond using property tax to pay the bond, but they didn't put the marijuana in the trust fund, so they don't have, unless they take out another bond. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. It's very close to a housing trust fund because those monies that are dedicated to the unhoused population could be used for the housing trust fund, but it's not technically going directly into the housing trust fund, kind of outside of the appropriations process. So
In Kansas, I mean, I was on this housing task force years ago, and Kansas looked at a Kansas housing trust fund. And I bet that was 20 years ago, and they still haven't committed or found a sustainable source. Am I correct on that? They're
Correct.
still not funding their housing trust fund.
correct, because of this really particular question. on
Yeah,
that
so the
sustainable
Kansas
dedicated funding.
can't, I mean, they're not unwilling to feed developers or unwilling to put general revenue into it.
There's not been any legislative action to do that. There's certainly a number of proposals, but nothing approved.
Commissioner Ashcraft and Commissioner Allenbrand.
You want to go ahead, Jeff?
I'm trying to get everybody in order.
Sometimes your head always looks that way.
Once in a while.
I always feel
We
like
got
he's
Linda
looking at
down.
Mike, so.
Everyone's got their opinion.
Thank you, Mr.
Go
Chair.
ahead, Commissioner Ashcraft.
Everybody had lunch. so
In the analysis that you did you reflect any on the potential that the cities, as the drivers of the standard of living of Johnson County, might be able or willing or ought to participate in this funding opportunity?
Yeah, I think that would be inherent with any sort of program, because obviously if we don't have that city communication buy-in, we'd be very limited to just the unincorporated part of the county.
I just didn't see it
Yeah.
in the report. The second question is, and I'm sorry, I should have looked this up, and I don't remember, but, and Commissioner Hanslick, forgive me if it runs opposed to what you might have been thinking, but we have a steady stream of CDBG funding that we have used for certain projects. It's not substantial, but I think it's $1 million. It's a fairly significant amount.
Johnson County only gets like a fourth of that million.
Yeah, but have we considered, because we are going through the 5-year plan now in terms of remodeling, reimagining the use of CDBG funds, have you thought about considering this? And maybe it's not possible, but if that is a sustainable resource, at least at some level, to support it? Was that part of your conversation?
Well, I think it's certainly an area where we could talk about blending and braiding funding, and where we could talk about using CDBG dollars alongside housing trust fund dollars. I do not believe that HUD regulations would allow us to just take CDBG dollars and dump them into a housing trust fund, because when you structure a housing trust fund, you're essentially structuring the types of programs that you want to fund. You're kind of coming up with the scoring metrics for how you would put that funding out there and how people could successfully apply for that money. And CDBG already has all of that outlined.
Well, yeah, that may warrant further discussion, because that's been an issue of some debate in terms of what CDBG regionally projects versus what the national opportunities are. And I just put that on the table for further conversation. Thank you.
Commissioner Allenbrand and Commissioner Myers.
Do you want to go first, Commissioner Myers, because you had your hand up before me? Go ahead. Okay, a couple of questions. Well, first of all, this is, all cities are involved in this, and for the county to take on that responsibility, you're talking more staff, maybe a mill levy increase, tax increase, and also, being a former builder, in development and building, you also have to get approval through cities. So to me, I would rather continue to partnership, as we're doing now with landlords and vouchers and Habitat for Humanity, than creating our own staff to set this up. I'd rather take the money and help get other projects going. So I'm struggling with, because we've put money, we're hoping to help support a homeless shelter, but we don't want to run it, so we're going to do an RFQ. So, and then we've done these, so I struggle with this because I feel like it's just going to be a money pit where that money can go to help in the other cities to create something with them as partners.
Commissioner Myers and Commissioner O'Hara.
Thank you, Chair. So I agree with Mr. Ashcraft that CDBG could be a player somehow, whether it's supplemental or even beyond that, because we've heard different discussions in DC of how those funds could be used. But I do think it could at least be supplemental. I like to look at multiple funding sources. I don't think just having one dedicated source works for all. So I kind of like the idea of even though I know what funding sources are the best and the most consistent, but I also know that if you have a funding source, kind of like what Topeka has, for an allocated for matching funds, that can be a good source of income. And my thinking is that, and I've brought this up several times, but I think people should be able to share in pieces of the pie, and that's with the opioid funds. And, that's a source of revenue that we're receiving, that I know there's different directions that we want some of those monies to go, but I think a piece of that pie could go towards this, and that would be good to be used for that type of seeding money for possible things such as a matching fund, part of the formula. I know that, again, you can have the dedicated sales taxes mentioned, and it can go before the legislature and the voters. New sales tax can go before the legislature and the voters. Can dedicated mill levy go to a vote?
It could. It wouldn't be necessary, however. It could just be part of.
Right, but again, I'm saying if.
Public buy-in.
Could you do a ballot question?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if that's even a possible.
I can certainly check into that. I haven't considered that particular question. But
Because again, I've been involved with sales tax and
Wasn't
new
the
sales
cars
tax.
a vote? When we did a dedicated cars mill levy, wasn't that a vote?
That probably was, yeah.
That's way before my time. Mike could probably.
Further, Commissioner O'Hara was
mean,
next. Hey,
smack.
Let's keep it on the rails, guys. Thank you. Commissioner O'Hara.
Everyone's going to be shocked, but I agree with Commissioner Allenbrand that we absolutely should not be setting up something separate. It's just going to be a money pit, and we need to make sure that these dollars are getting to where they need to go, and to ask our constituents to shoulder another tax increase is a non-starter.
Okay. Question from Commissioner Ashcraft. It's the A's. It's after lunch.
It's the hairline, I know.
I know. Go ahead, sir.
Did you have any, did you think about, and forgive me, this will be jaded, but we currently have in state statutes the ability for cities to levy TIFs, create TIF districts, and those districts sometimes are used to build luxury apartments. Is there any discussion or thought about looking at, and probably require statutory change or relationships with the cities to get them to include that. Is that even possible?
There is some ability within what was formerly known as the Rural Housing Incentive District.
Right. Oh, yeah, that one, definitely.
Housing Incentive
Yeah.
District Program. But again, that would require the partnership with the cities. It is certainly a policy option that would be on the table as kind of one arm into the
Okay, thank you.
Couple questions for me, and then we're going to move on to the next part of the presentation. I think you have discussed it, Mr. Dapp, but if you could clarify for folks the difference between a dedicated sales tax and a new sales tax.
So a dedicated sales tax would be similar to the stormwater sales tax that we currently have that is levied countywide, 0.1%. That revenue goes directly into the stormwater program. A new sales tax would essentially be adding another version of that. So it would be similar to the stormwater tax that would be levied countywide, but it would be in addition to, and would essentially take advantage of the capacity that we have to add additional incremental sales tax from the county level. So the dedicated sales tax is kind of an example of what a new housing trust fund sales tax would look like, that we would levy for a particular purpose. Those funds would go directly into that program.
Thank you.
To interject, Mr. Chair, dedicated is restricted use of those funds.
No, I
Okay.
was just making sure that explanation got out there for everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Talk to me about the City of Lawrence's program. And they have split their sales tax between housing and transportation. How do they split it? How much goes to each? And we've seen what they've been able to do from a housing perspective. How much of that has gone to transportation, or if you know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but we can certainly provide that information on the breakdown of total amount received, what has gone to housing, and what has gone to transportation infrastructure.
Okay. And then, of these examples in our region, there hasn't really been a good example, as I understand from a funding perspective, where there's a public, private, and philanthropic, multi-source sustained funding model. Is that correct?
That's correct. I do think that's Mark's vision or LISC's vision for what they want to do regionally, but again, as we talked about, the number of demands on the fund grow, it can kind of eliminate or diminish the impact that it can have in different areas. So pros and cons, probably.
Absolutely. Policy choices. Commissioner Hanslick.
Yes, I just wanted to mention something in regard to what Commissioner Ashcraft talked about with the perhaps requiring developments to have set-asides. There is a Senate Bill 366 that actually prohibits what's called inclusionary zoning. So that's something that kind of makes it very difficult. I know some cities have been able to kind of do some workarounds. They've also been able to have some voluntary participation and that kind of thing, but the state legislature has kind of cut off that.
That's for the TIFs, as Mark pointed out, or Mr. Dapp pointed out. It's the rural incentive districts have a lot more flexibility.
Yes.
And they seem to be growing in popularity in Johnson County since that was changed. So, but it's us being at the table is the argument, or if not us, this issue being at the table, because this helps the cities as much, if not more than us, I would think.
Oh, for sure. All right, policy question number 2.
Okay. One quick note on city involvement. Kansas City, Missouri has done some thinking around how to really sequester funds that are maybe coming in from different jurisdictions or philanthropic organizations that only want to fund in a certain footprint of the city. And there are some models for how to sort of include city funding and really just target it to those jurisdictions, development in those jurisdictions. So Again, as we talked about, this is a little bit like the funding discussion, and the pro and the con is that the possibilities are sort of endless here. Again, the simplest administration is in-house, and it really relies on staff to just follow the creating legislative document to review and score the applications. Often these are smaller trust funds, and they really are only dealing with calls for proposal once or twice a year. Let's see. We already talked about a little bit of this. At their most complex, some of the housing trust funds operate like a CDFI with a significant loan portfolio. And again, there's some opportunity to really take advantage of CRA or some of these other really large-scale funding opportunities. I don't know that there's anything new here to offer. Sort of broadly, the options for administration fall in three buckets. One is really sort of just county staff. We might think about maybe 1 to 3 staff or even existing staff. Typically, the operating budgets for these are less than about $250,000. Hybrid administration with an advisory board. So again, these are boards that are created to sort of score and oversee the application process and make funding decisions or recommendations with some significant staff support, or this option for a totally independent operation where the county's role would really just be to administer essentially the financial data or the money management piece of it. So to wrap up, housing trust funds are intended to spark new development of missing housing units in the market that are otherwise just not going to be built. I do want to sort of put the expectation out there that even in something like this, new units that will be created are going to take years to develop. But this, like other policy options, gives us an opportunity to develop partnerships to address housing needs by working, as you said, Mr. Ashcraft, through cities, including also large employers, faith communities, healthcare entities, and financial institutions. I think there's probably a lot of untapped partnerships we could pursue. And because we're really building the metrics that we want to see in at the beginning, we can encourage some of the efficiencies and track the taxpayer's return on investment from the very beginning with a fund like this. So general recommendations, a housing trust fund is a concept that sort of reverses your typical policy process, which is that we identify a need or a policy priority, we identify a solution, and then we fund the solution. This kind of identifies the funding first by way of dedicating a sustainable funding source, and then develops the program metrics and administration from there. So there's a good reason for this reversal, because a housing trust fund is a large-scale, long-term project, and if there's really no appetite to identify sustainable funding, it's not worth dedicating the staff time to developing the program. We've seen that model in other cities, and it's not particularly effective. Ultimately, a path forward could include dedication of one-time funding that allows the county to test these concepts to engage the market and public reaction, while simultaneously pursuing long-term funding that may need legislative or voter approval. I do want to say that we can still make progress on housing issues in this typical sort of policy approach, especially on smaller or highly targeted initiatives like our landlord incentive program or some of the other things that have come before this board recently. Either way, we remain dedicated to partnerships and collaboration with the community to ensure that the programs that we're designing enhance and don't duplicate the other work that's being done on this issue. That is it for us, and we're looking forward to your feedback.
First of all, I want to thank staff for going through the effort to put this report together. I understand that it wasn't easy, and it's well done. So thank you all for doing that. One of the questions I want to jump back to, still staying at the 10,000-foot level, Ms. Foreman, you mentioned, I think it was page 8, you were talking about what is and where are the needs in Johnson County when it comes to housing. How do we feel about where we are in terms of understanding that fundamental question? There's obviously a big realm of housing choices. We have subsidized voucher housing in Johnson County. We have multiple millions of dollar houses in Johnson County and everything in between. where are we on understanding where the need is now, where a housing trust fund or something else would be able to target those needs?
We do have quite a bit of information. We could always use more data, but we do have quite a bit of information around where those needs are. And looking at this continuum, they're really down at that chronic homelessness, experiencing homelessness range, and also vulnerable populations, because as I mentioned, we have no permanent supportive housing in Johnson County. We have no shelter beds for adults who are experiencing homelessness, and we really are, a lot of the data that we've pulled together to think through some of our policies on that end of the spectrum really show that we are missing that sort of first step housing, those units that are very affordable for very vulnerable populations. What happens after you experience homelessness and then want to exit into permanent housing? Where are the units for you? Those really are missing from our market, but I will say, that is also a tiny portion of our population. So while it might be the greatest need in terms of number, the number of residents that may need assistance along other areas of that continuum is probably larger. There's probably some really low-hanging fruit around first-time home buyers and helping them get into the market at interest rates that they can afford or with down payment assistance. We certainly need to think about preserving our existing housing stock. And then I think as we sort of step up and try and think about those market changes that we can make, it's really this missing middle, different types of housing that offer more housing choice, different price points, and are accessible for a variety of populations.
And I appreciate you highlighting that it's not just one solution that we're looking for, and because there's not just one need. And we talked earlier, it's National Planning Month. I've said that 4 times today, but I think it's important to recognize that the only constant we have is change. And so while we all have a perception about what Johnson County looks like, that's not the same way that Johnson County looked 40 years ago, and it can't be the way, if we're going to continue to thrive as Johnson County, the way that Johnson County is going to look in 40 years. So we need to be cognizant of that opportunity for our community and what kind of housing options we have. That includes preservation of of existing affordable housing. How else we address that missing middle, how we help first-time home builders. I think one of the most jarring stats that was reinforced earlier today, 45% of the people that work in Johnson County don't live in Johnson County. And a lot of those, some of those are by choice, but I'd argue that the majority of those is because they can't afford that housing in Johnson County. These are our police officers. These are our firefighters. These are our teachers. People that are very ingrained within our community, are crucial to our community, don't have this option or options. So I appreciate that we need to continue the focus on how we bring these options forward. So before I get too deep off of the soapbox, let me open it up for comments from others. Commissioner Hanslick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for this very thorough report and very frank report on the possibility of a housing trust fund and the realities and barriers and challenges. When the Housing Subcommittee formed, our task and our mission was to try to identify unique opportunities for the county to help address these issues. We recognize the county cannot do all this by ourselves. It's impossible. And we need to work with the state, the cities, public-private types of partnerships that we cannot be the be-all and end-all. We don't have those kind of resources, nor should we be the only ones. So thinking about that, thinking about a housing trust fund from that perspective, one of the, as was mentioned, I think we've had some very good success with helping to provide that gap funding for some of the projects that have come before us. And I'm just wondering if perhaps a step between nothing or a PRN kind of a basis and a housing trust fund might be something like an affordable housing fund that we could put some of the CSF money in, but have it a very narrow focus to be gap funding for those projects when there's, they have the low-income housing tax credits and just need that help to get over the finish line, or as we did with the Habitat project for the infrastructure. Not that that's going to be the answer forever and ever, because that would not be sustainable funding, but it might be a first step to designate that we as a board want to support the development of housing and especially those lower rent types of availability for folks trying to get out of homelessness. But I'm wondering if that could be a first step while we continue to ponder the options for a housing trust fund and what might be longer-term sustainable funding, because there's a lot to digest in this information, and I don't know about anybody else, but I don't think anybody's ready to, let's mill levy, let's I doubt anybody here is ready to do that, but I know everybody here wants to do something.
Janae, or Commissioner Hanslick, thank you for that. Just for the benefit of everybody, can you succinctly repeat what that suggestion was?
Well, for affordable housing fund, kind of like they're doing in Wichita, it's Wichita, and that's Sedgwick County, isn't it? It's the city, where they've just put money into a fund for specific housing needs. Again, I'm thinking of this as a kind of a stopgap measure that we could be using to help support housing development while we ponder a housing trust fund or perhaps other options.
Is that succinct enough for you? Commissioner Fass?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Hanslick. That was something I was thinking about. I talked to Robin, and she said that fund could have different cost centers. The home repairs, you all know, I've talked about. And, I hear from seniors probably weekly. I'll be at a coffee shop and somebody will come up to me about they feel like they're being priced out of their home, but they have nowhere to go. In this women's group at Village Presbyterian, and 3 of the people of that group had to move out of Prairie Village because of just all the home repairs and the lack of senior housing. And so we have that $4 million that we've dedicated of COVID funds for a home repair program, but I'd really like us to see some sustainable funding for that to preserve affordable housing. And UCS has that map where there's homes that have safety codes. Overland Park, I think, and I could have this wrong, identified 13,000 homes with safety codes. Olathe has a large number of homes, that have safety modifications that are needed or accessibility modifications. And, we've already made that a priority, and there's still a lot of work to have that. And could that be just a small grant program? Contractors are really hard to find. I mean, our home program, which I talked about the other week, that my tiny little house wouldn't even, of 824 square feet, would not qualify for our home program. Our home program right now, the way it is, hardly, I mean, it doesn't serve the needs of our county anymore. And that we have, a similar program, small grant, home repair, that really targets in of safety concerns and maybe targets in, to our seniors, veterans, people with disabilities. But you said in that slide, you can do everything and then do nothing. And I've seen that in my life, my whole public service being, a social worker. When you try to do everything, you do nothing. And so that we really just, maybe like a Commissioner Hanslick idea, prairie fire, it's not prairie fire, but Michael Snodgrass's, the development, they're about ready to open. And that was due to home funds and GAP funds. That we really prioritize down and get that home repair off the ground, and that, maybe one other. I don't think we have the capacity right now. And it all comes down to just listening. I have 11 cities, and zoning issues are just, when you rezone for housing, it really is, that's really a city county, we can say we want more missing middle, but if a city a city's not willing to have variety in their zoning, it won't happen. And that's different from us that in Douglas County, Wyandotte County, is that we have 20 cities. And then, that is really key. We can talk all about that we want affordable apartments, but that is really a city issue, not our issue. And some of the suggestions, Megan, that you made. So where is our impact on this is, my question, and how do we create priorities?
Megan?
I think you create priorities based on the impact that you want to see. And I think that's, certainly something we can come back with more information about. But that's part of the, direction that we're hoping for too.
Sorry, Commissioner Allen Brand.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I know that I could have never afford a home, if I had to go buy a home now, back when, when I was supporting children and trying to go to school and doing all those things. But, there are several apartment complexes that are coming up. One in the city of Gardner, well, there's a couple in Gardner, but one was the city of Gardner did an incentive with them on their rental rates. But I think what I'm really trying to get at is that, and there's a lot of rural housing incentives that are coming up. I think eventually those houses, after they're sold, maybe once or twice, they're going to go back up to market value. So if you if you go into the unincorporated area, you go to any company and talk to employees, they can't afford to live here. And so that means they have to be able to afford to go in somewhere either with a voucher or with some kind of rental agreement with the landlords that you've been working on, or Habitat for Humanity housing. That's the only thing I can relate to now. And I'm going to continue to work in the cities that I'm at to try to find the possibility of doing that. You've got to find the person with the land, you've got to find the city that's willing to do it, and then it safeguards it. Because that's my concern, that, we can hire all the staff we want, we can put all the money into this, and where does that stop for the person who's trying to start off again, entry level?
Do you
So-
mean utilizing land trusts to keep it in that affordable space?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's why I like Habitat for Humanity, because of all the training and the education that goes into that. They prepare people for their, to get their loans, they have a balance. Then they can take that money and then purchase a home, which they have a lot of those in Olathe. There's those, in fact, Olathe probably has more than anybody else. But but it's growing in other areas. But again, those values are going to keep going up because there's no, so I'm kind of with Commissioner Hanslick. I'd rather see that money go somewhere else than to have money on staff. And not that I don't appreciate everything that you do, because I can't imagine what went into this, but I'd much rather look at projects that you see coming forward that maybe we can partner with.
Commissioner Hanslick.
Thank you. Yes, I think the point about the cities is really important, and that's where I think that's something we have to continue to have discussions about. Again, I go back to the county cannot solve all these problems ourselves, and we can't provide the funding for everything. So I don't know if establishing an affordable housing fund and we put funding in there from CSF, if maybe at some point that would be something we'd want to talk to cities about. Well, you could be part of this too if you want to contribute funds to this affordable housing fund, and then your city can access that money when you have projects, or it could be part of the county's support for something in your city. I just think it's really important, and along the same lines with the major and minor home repairs, that I think it'd be very helpful to explore options for working together with the cities rather than everybody having 20 different minor and major home repair funds. That we have one central place where cities can contribute to that, and then people only have to apply one place, and the requirements are consistent, and we can have consistent providers that provide that repair, that we know they're doing the right thing. So my thought is, I think we have a lot more to think about in terms of a housing trust fund, and certainly I'm thinking about our previous sales taxes. They've been championed by community groups, like our JCERT, gosh, that's been 20 years, something like that. The public safety sales tax, that was, I think the League of Women Voters was a big supporter of that, and they did all kinds of campaigning out in the community before that vote. So it's not something that I think the county can just say, well, here, we want to do this. If it needs to be a grassroots effort from the community. If they want to try to convince residents to support either the continuation of an existing sales tax or a new tax.
Commissioner Myers.
Thank you, Chair. My head's spinning. I've got my wheels turning.
Had lunch.
Yes, I like this stuff, but it drives you crazy, doesn't it? I just read, it's election time, and I read all these articles, and everything I'm reading from these candidates in the cities are saying affordable housing is the county's problem, not the city's problem. And we're sitting here saying affordable housing is, the cities have a lot to do with that, and the county can only do, so much. I agree with what you said earlier, Commissioner Hanslick. It's everybody working together. There's been talk about teachers and firefighters and policemen. I really think we need to look at who is it that we're really trying to have impact on. Teachers, firefighters, policemen, they're going to figure it out. I was one of them. I was at $17,000 a year, 18% interest rate on my home, but I was healthy. Firefighters, policemen, teachers, for most part, they're healthy people. They'll figure it out. But keeping people in their homes that need help being able to stay in their homes, or the very less fortunate, the homeless. Those are what I believe are the target areas for whatever it is that is done. I think that's where people throughout Johnson County, they see and hear. Not that there aren't, again, it's economy, inflation, it hits everybody. But there are, I think, more specific, hardcore needs from the groups of people that I've talked about than some of the others that have been mentioned here today. So, again, my wheels are turning, and that's the thing, is that we're all wanting to come up with solutions that some way we can have positive impact and have an effect that's going to be good for our community. So I'm rambling.
That's okay. No, and you're right, Commissioner Myers, this is a deep well. But one thing I also want to recognize is that, yes, we got to identify who we're trying to help here, and I think it's everybody. But let's particularly talk about the economic circumstances of those who are trying to buy a home now, who are a teacher. And I appreciate that teachers of the past have grinded and found a way to find that first home in Johnson County. I would challenge you to look at the circumstances now and realize it's not the same as it was 40 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago. The wages for those jobs and the cost of housing, the availability of housing is markedly different. And so,
Probably for the better. I'm sorry.
and I'd say let's look at the statistics and recognize that those who are looking for their first home, it is a different marketplace now than it was 40 years ago. And so we need to adapt if we want those kind of folks to have an opportunity to have their first home in Johnson County, whether it be a home, a condo, whatever it looks like, because the supply is not, frankly, just not available right now. So I don't want to get too deep into that part, but what I appreciate that Commissioner Hanslick and others have set up here is that we need to dedicate funding to this if we're going to get serious about this. You know, we can put, we can and should help those who are in homes right now and preserve that existing affordable housing. The minor major home improvement programs are great. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors programs within cities are also great to supplement together. But I think we also need to think about how we get real to addressing this problem from a sustainable funding source. To me, that is the first step. And I am supportive of having staff address how we partner with cities, how we partner with philanthropy, how we partner with the private sector, and come up with a sustained funding method for supporting affordable housing in Johnson County. And once we're able to have a real conversation and a model, then we can have a policy discussion about whether we put that model into place or whether it requires us to take it to our partners and the champions, as Commissioner Hanslick mentioned, of that partnership if it goes to the voters. But we need to have that sustained funding in a realistic format so that if this is truly one of our big four priorities, we can see it through. So I'll stop rambling. Commissioner Ashcraft and Commissioner Allen.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think you were rambling. I think you were spot on. Been talking too much. I apologize. I'm going to lose my voice. A couple of things, though. I wanted to pause because I wanted to kind of build on what you've said and several of us have said to Ms. Foreman. I've been here, some say too long, but a number of years. And I wanted to say that the report you gave the parlance I was used to was a white paper. But your white paper on this subject, I would submit, has been probably one of the best, if not the best, that I've seen come out of this organization. So I commend you for that. I think it covers a complex topic, the nuances, and there are a lot of subtleties there. And you and I know the guy to your right may have helped a little bit, and the guy to your left probably helped a lot. But I appreciate that work, and I think it definitely was a good step forward. But Mr. Chairman, I wanted to build on and maybe elaborate. Gosh. Fortunately, I'm not singing either. Yeah, that's what I want to do. Build on what you said. Back on slide 10, I think that's probably a critical slide, going to several points that have been raised up here, including by you, Mr. Chairman, is to get some sense of, the term I would use is the census, what the population is in those three categories. If you want to use those categories, and they're fine with me, or if you want to change them, but to get some sense, because I think different communities will have different needs and expectations on those areas. And if we want to sell this to them, we should be able to show how it's impacting their communities, and not just for them to provide financial support, but also maybe reflect on what they're doing. And I think Commissioner Fast touched upon this, like with zoning, but the cost of regulations and has an impact on the cost of housing. So each of these populations having an understanding of how big they are and what we'd like to accomplish, because all due respect, and you did what I think you should have done, talking about governance, but I don't think we're there yet. Okay, so we can talk about it, and we should, but I want to set that aside and piggyback on what the chair said, is looking at how are we going to make this sustainable and what it looks like. Is it this package, or is it this package, or is it the whole package? Because those are big financial impacts, but they also are big community impacts. So I would encourage you to try to frame it that way. And I would encourage you to take a multidisciplined approach to how you attack those issues. And I would include us, what we can and can't do. And again, Mr. Chairman, us being at the table when the cities launch out on some of these financial opportunities, just to be there and remind them, hey, you could include a transit component, you could include a housing component, you could include whatever. So that's my rambling.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Allen, I don't think it was rambling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your wife, I just got a text from her to tell you to keep talking so you lose your voice before you go. Anyway.
Well, she doesn't want me
joking aside.
talk at home, so that's fine.
I do want to say, though, because being in the unincorporated area with so much development going on, and, you've got land that's never been developed before, and you've got land that has, no water, no sanitation, and so economic development impact of incentives, and if they're done right, and they have been proven for that to happen, and you've seen some of them that are coming forward where they do have, they've allowed for school, fire station, pilot programs to the fire, to the fire stations, and so that's all part of being at the table. But also, the other thing is I think Commissioner Myers was right, to me, that some of the vouchers and some of the things that we're doing, you've got the Taco Bell workers, the people that don't have a high school diploma that's trying to get that diploma, trying to buy a car, and they can't afford even to get into the first home. So there's different variables of what needs to be done. The other interesting thing when we started on that subcommittee is to hear about all the programs that were out there for the homeless that we were even unaware of. Warming stations, And, as I've been asking around, there's a lot of programs going on in different cities, from snow removal, meals, repair services for homes in different cities. There's a lot of services that each city is providing as well. So that could be interesting as well, but that would create a lot of work. But anyway, I think we all are kind of on the same page, but of course, giving you more work.
And I forgot to mention for the record, Commissioner Hara has left the meeting. Commissioner Fast.
Yeah, well, like City of Mission just approved a second project, 10% of it's going to be attainable. This is their second new construction, and I know you've talked about it. Gardner's has a number of new projects going up that have, market rates, some below, some
give
has.
them incentives.
Yeah, is there any way that we could, and I saw the DeSoto mayor this week, he was talking about missing mental housing that's going there. So, I mean, we're standing here acting like it's not happening, and a lot of it is. I know and Overland Park has really encouraged. So each of the cities, a number of the cities has really worked on it. I don't know if that's something that you could compile so we could see, the units that are, the city managers could maybe get, the new units that are affordable, attainable, market rate. Those are all different definitions.
We could also report it, being in our districts too. I should probably report more on that.
All right. So here's what I'd like to circle back on. I'm going to add, Mr. Connor, did you want to?
I just was going to try to maybe summarize what I'm hearing, but if you'd like to.
Let me take a shot, and then why don't you add any color or nuance that's necessary. So I think, first of all, everybody cares and recognizes that this is a crucial issue. It's one of our big four, and we need to address it. We all recognize that we can't do it by ourselves, but we also recognize that there's leadership here, and there's opportunities for partnership at multiple levels of government, but also with non-governmental partners. So I think and what I'd like to suggest is that we direct staff to research and bring back more specific information as it relates to sustainable funding sources and suggestions for a focus on affordable housing. And at that point, we can also discuss, let me leave it there and not tack on too much to it.
Just affordable housing, not this, what do you call it, continuum?
So I don't want to limit it specifically to a trust fund at this time, because whether we do a trust fund, whether we do a land trust, whether we do other kind of support programs, whether we partner with a CDFI and buy down points on a loan, whatever it may be, whatever we decide is crucial or the right tool to use, I think the first step that we need is sustained funding, and we got to figure out how we're going to do that first.
Correct, but just on affordable housing, or does it include all these potential services, supports for the, in the
Like apartment
continuum?
vouchers and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So I was looking at affordable housing
just
specifically.
affordable housing.
What does that, yeah, I guess we're not.
What's the level?
Preserving our residential housing stock with home modifications is affordable housing,
It is.
Okay, so you want a broad versus narrow definition?
I want to specifically focus on the funding mechanisms, not to get into,
No, I got that.
Oh, not to service end.
no, so it's a two-step process, I think. And so the first step is, how are we going to fund it? How are we going to pay for it? And does that make sense? And Joe, any color you need to add?
I just was going to say that there's a lot of questions around researching what cities are doing, what's happening in the current market. I think that would be part of that process, is to, from a sustainable funding source, what are the other cities, philanthropies, private businesses, what are they doing in this space also?
Right. And I think from there, we can determine kind of what next steps then might look like. Commissioner Ashcraft?
I don't disagree. I just don't want us to be so narrow, because this continuum is quite extensive, and And I think Ms. Foreman talked about low-hanging fruit. There may be low-hanging fruits in other parts of this continuum that I would hate to miss. Everything from the homeless to accessibility issues to housing enhancements, as well as accessibility or affordability of homes, but the whole structure. So that's my only hesitation. I don't disagree. I just don't want us to be too narrow.
So what if I take out the word affordable and just say housing? I mean,
To me, that, yeah.
my goal isn't to be narrow. They're just like a housing trust fund to me, doesn't necessarily focus on just one point on the continuum, but a housing trust fund could serve multiple points on the continuum. I want our research as it relates to sustainable funding to focus on the opportunity to focus on multiple points on the continuum as opposed to just one.
And for us, in the conversation, it's easy to understand, but then when it rolls out and it takes on a life of its own in the public, for it to be formed into a narrow silo is the concern, potential concern.
No, I understand that concern, so long as staff understands what that direction looks like. Is there any clarifying questions you all need on this recommendation I'm going to call for a vote on?
I think we understand it.
And so, but before we get there, is there a second to that?
Second.
Okay. Questions? Commissioner Hansett?
Just to clarify that I understand what we're talking about is, you would like a vote on directing staff to
Further
bring
research.
back more information on sustainable funding for, to meet the county's critical housing needs.
Someone could be a partner.
Is that, okay, I just want to make sure, sometimes we have votes and I've never actually heard the motion or what it actually
Well,
is. so-
critical housing needs, I think that could be a pretty broad umbrella. I would be more comfortable with that than, all due respect, and how you framed it.
In
Yeah,
terms
they-
of, so long as staff understands. I think we're good.
We're going to vote on whatever staff
Where's the money
understands.
coming from?
That's mainly the point.
Yeah, what's-
And we
Where's the
can
money?
argue over what the nuances
Yeah.
mean, but we're wanting specific direction, or we're giving direction.
We want specific direction.
Well, we want specific information about what models are there and what we can do to really get sustained funding for this mission. Commissioner Fast?
Well, they said sales, property tax, we have the COVID funding, but you're just wanting them to narrow that down. I guess we could, could take out a GO bond, we could pass marijuana tax.
Other funding.
Mr. Depp?
If I can try to clarify
Yeah.
just how we're, or at least myself, is receiving this, is when we initially looked at it through a lens of a housing trust fund funding mechanism, we're now kind of broadening that out to a program inventory of what is currently being offered, opportunities for partnerships, but going just beyond a funding mechanism for housing trust fund, but what other opportunities do we have to dive in to address the critical housing needs beyond just a housing trust fund, but along that entire continuum, any number of options.
Can you put federal home loan on it? I've been asking, because they fund housing grants, and I've been asking that we meet with them.
So, and not just to bring us the same bullet points, I want to get specific here. What kind of sales tax, what percent of an eighth of a cent, what that number's going to look like, and what partnership dollars-wise might look like with cities, with philanthropies, with maybe other NGOs. So long as y'all understand that we want specific opportunities and what the funding and the numbers look like, and then how we might utilize that amount. That will be a policy level discussion about to where we might put those dollars.
Mr. Chairman, would you like staff to actually begin to reach out to potential partners and get their observations, ideas, concerns, like cities, for example?
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely, it couldn't hurt. I think having a conversation with Mark or LISC and/or other CDFIs, I think getting some ideas of yeah, what interest there is in partnership and what that level looks like would be important for the next step in our discussion here.
Because we already have the model where the cities contribute as we contribute to UCS funds. I mean, this would be way beyond that, but that model does exist, so. And we're going to look at CDBG funds too, right?
Any more
That whole
questions
300,000.
or clarification at this point?
We only get 300 of them.
No. Linda, would you call the roll, please, then?
Commissioner Fast.
Aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Myers, aye.
Commissioner O'Hara is absent. Commissioner Hanslick.
Hanslick, aye.
Commissioner Ashcraft.
Yes.
Commissioner Allenbrand.
Allenbrand, aye.
And Chairman Kelly.
Aye, 6 votes in favor, none against. Is that consistent with your count?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and close this committee of the whole then. We'll look forward to continued discussion from staff when this comes back. I want to thank all of our partners who have come today for your passion and your dedication on these topics. It is 2:30. We are adjourned. Everybody have a good evening. And again, thank you all very much for the very good report.